and more often these days, disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, fire, chemical spills, other industrial accidents, they're fast becoming for many people the new normal. For most of us, it's frightening enough to battle disasters, or even the threat of them. They can occur anywhere, anytime. So imagine then for a moment how much more scary for the man or woman who can't see to escape a falling tree or can't hear a radio message to evacuate a flooded community. Disasters hit the disabled harder than the general population because they often are unable to take the steps necessary to protect their lives, and all too often, the so-called able-bodied community just doesn't think about their needs. Well, on this International Day for Disaster Reduction, the special focus is on a not-so-obvious Caribbean conversation: disaster and disability. Joining me tonight, Ronald Jackson is the region's point man on disaster management. He is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. For almost 6 years, he served as Director General of ODPEM, that's the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica. It put him at the heart of Jamaica's disaster response in Hurricanes Charlie and Ivan in 2004, Dennis and Emily 2005, Hurricane Dean 2007, Tropical Storm Gustav 2009, and not a few floods. And in 2010, he ran the response to the catastrophic Haiti earthquake from the Caribbean Northwest subregion. Also tonight, at the age of 4, Kerryann Ifill lost her sight because of cataracts, but she never lost sight of her drive to succeed, becoming the first blind person to graduate from the University of the West Indies, a degree in sociology and psychology in 1999. From there, it's been a dramatic rise in politics and in advocacy for the disabled. In 2008, she was appointed the Deputy President of Barbados' upper parliamentary chamber, the Senate. In politics, now Senator Ifill holds the distinction of being the first woman, the youngest person, and the first person with a disability to be President of the Senate, a post she's held for the last year and a half. And she continues to be the national voice of the disabled as President of the Barbados Council for the Disabled. Stephen O'Malley is the resident representative of the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP. He's in charge of the United Nations system for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. In times of disaster, the United Nations responds to humanitarian needs. You'll also get from him the international perspective on what the disabled want, need, and expect from the policymakers, and not just when disaster strikes, but how the world can prevent a disaster among the disabled. And he should know a thing or two about that because he's worked in the Office for the Coordinating of Humanitarian Affairs in the United Nations. Please join me in giving our panel a warm welcome. Now, along with our studio audience, we want to hear from you. You can call us toll-free at 1-855-213-7500. If you are in Barbados, it's a local call at 467-1045, 467-1045. You can also email us at IDDRcaribbean.com, IDDRcaribbean.com. And when we come back, we'll start our conversation not only by looking at the statistics on disaster, but what also constitutes a disaster. Sometimes it's a hurricane, it's an earthquake, it doesn't have to be a disaster. That's not the disaster, the experts will tell you. It's what happens to the people and what the people do that can create a disaster. We'll hear the direct perspective of the disabled on this. That's after the break. Stay with us.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place: Carib Vision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Carib Vision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cable Vision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Carib Vision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Traveling the Caribbean has never been easier or more convenient. Go to liat.com for super savings on fantastic Caribbean destinations. Click on the specials page for the latest promotions and fantastic deals. Go to the quick reference button for travel tips and baggage info. Sign up for travel insurance, which covers your entire trip. And sample Zing, our in-flight magazine with news and features on people and places. Just go with liat.com.
My name is Indrawati Ramnanan, and I do wheelchair dancing. When I was a year and 2 months old, my parents had just made some coffee and had it on the end of a table. When I crossed the bar, I went over and I pulled it down on my chest. Right? They rushed me to the hospital, which was a first-degree burn. Whatever happened, I don't know. Both legs became blue-black. Persons were saying I received wrong medications. People were saying the medication did not agree with me, and they said that if they didn't amputate my legs, I will die.
I love Indra. I love working with Indra. Thanks for making my life so easy. Words. Can I just show it? Can I just go and give her a hug?
An online survey produced by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction ahead of today, International Day for Disaster Reduction, paints a grim picture. Nearly 6,000 people with disabilities in 126 countries around the world were asked how they cope and prepare for disasters. Now, to the findings. A high proportion of people with disabilities die or are severely injured because disasters occur and they're rarely consulted about their needs. And the governments lack adequate measures to address them. For example, in cases where the disabled need to evacuate, such as during a flood or earthquake, only 1 in 5 respondents said they could evacuate immediately without difficulty. Only 1 in 5. 6% said they would not be able to evacuate at all. And I have a feeling that should be 60%. And the rest of them said they would be able to evacuate with a degree of difficulty. But if given enough time, the percentage of those people who could evacuate with no difficulty, that number almost doubles, rising from 20% to 38%. Let's look at one other finding of that survey. It shows that 71% of the people who responded, of the 6,000 people in the 126 countries, have no personal preparedness plan for disaster, and barely a third of them always have someone to help them. Barely a third have someone to help them. 13% have no one to help them at all. So let me go to Senator Ifill for who feels it, knows it. What's your experience talking to not only people in the local scenario in Barbados, but across the region about their experience of real experiences of disasters? We've had floods, we've had hurricanes in recent years. What have they been telling you?
Good evening. What they've been telling me is that they are unprepared. They don't feel included. They don't think shelters are ready for them. Most of them have no idea where they're to go, what they're to do. And most of the time, it is a lack of information. For example, you have ads put up on television. The following are the hurricane shelters, and they're all on the screen. A blind or visually impaired person cannot see them. There's no sign language. A deaf or hearing impaired person can't read that, can't understand when somebody's speaking. And then there are other challenges. You have emergency personnel who are not trained to help with the evacuation of persons with disabilities. And a lot of the time, they're not included in the discussion. They're left out. It's expected somebody else is going to take care of them. So there's not a reason to look after them.
Well, you just mentioned that there's an expectation that somebody will look after it. Is that part of the general perception that someone who is disabled must have a family member who is there holding their hand, quite literally, to take them to the shelter, to look out for them? Is there that general perception in the wider society that There must obviously be someone looking after someone who's disabled.
That is the perception for all aspects of lives of persons with disabilities. They always assume somebody else had to have done this for you, somebody else had to have taken care of you. So therefore, they only need to prepare for that family and you're okay. But what about the person with a disability who lives alone by choice? What about the person with a disability whose family members haven't been taught sign language, haven't been prepared, who aren't interested in working with that person, only sees you as a burden? What about those people? What about the families that don't know what help they could be giving their family member with a disability if only they knew that there was a shelter nearby that could accommodate the wheelchairs? What about those ones? And the reality is that persons with disabilities are people. We have the right to our independence, our own information, our secrecy, our privacy. And because we have those rights, then it cannot be assumed somebody else is taking care of our needs. We have to take charge of our needs as much as possible.
Well, let me ask you this particular question in relation to what you just said. You talked about people who choose to live alone. The cynical person might say, well, why would a person who's disabled live alone?
Simple. You have the right to do so. If you choose to have your own family, if you choose to have your own privacy, your home environment may not have been accommodating. You just want to have that place of your own. You want to be master of your own domain. In Barbados, we say two mistresses can't run the same house. And you're a woman of 35 and you want to be able to decide if you're coming in late, if the boyfriend's sleeping over, if you want to run around the house in your bikinis, whatever you want to do, that's your choice. Mommy says no because mommy still sees you as a little girl. Mommy still sees you as a little boy till you pick up your clothes off the floor. You have the right to your own privacy. And because you have that right, because you want to be in charge of your own destiny, then you choose to live alone. I've met persons in international countries who are what you would call high dependency, and they live alone by choice because that's your right.
The constitution of the country in which you happen to preside over the Senate, does it say anything about the rights of the disabled being enshrined, any greater rights than the rest of the society?
Unfortunately, disability is not included in the Constitution, but Barbados recently ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which signals that Barbados is committed to understanding the various rights of persons with disabilities, and included among that is the right for the government to be obligated to ensure the protection of persons with disabilities in the event of disasters and humanitarian emergencies.
Ronald Jackson, you've been hearing Senator Ifill talk about the experiences explained to her, described to her. What's been your experience directly? I gave a long list of disasters that you had to supervise the response to. What did you meet in Jamaica?
Well, I mean, I've not particularly been on the ground myself, but before I go, let me just wish you all good evening. Good evening, Senator, and my colleague, Stephen, and to you, Julius. But what I would say is that I've found over the period that I've been in the business that we've taken a generalist approach to treating with disaster planning, preparedness. And it manifested itself over the period of time that I served at the national level. And it is that lesson that we learned over those first few events that allowed us to recognize that we had to bring some of the different groups of our societies who face different challenges together to the table to be a part of the planning process.
How does that happen?
Well, we use the established groups. For example, Senator Ifill represents the disabled community. She is the president of that particular body. And there are such bodies as well in Jamaica. And we brought them to the table, obviously, through their representation. In fact, we have what we call the National Disaster Management Committee. And on that committee sits a representative from the disabled grouping. When we're having our pre-strike meetings, they're invited to be a part of that discussion. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I think one of the things we recognize, and when we reflect on this whole constitutional right for the safety of our citizens, there is no lesser right to persons with disabilities. In fact, they should enjoy the very same rights to be safe in these kinds of conditions as should all citizens. And so it means that therefore resources, from what I've experienced, that more resources have to be put into the mix to deal with some of these issues that we face.
Again, I said to you earlier that the experts will tell you that this thing called hurricane, flood, earthquake is not a disaster. Now, explain in greater detail when experts say it's not a disaster.
Right.
You know, someone at home is saying it is for me. So explain that.
Well, I mean, these aren't disasters. Actually, these are natural hazards. These are
Hazards.
The disasters are always anthropogenic. They're always inputs of man. It is how we build. We pretty much construct the conditions that lead to an event that exceeds our resources, or personal resources, or personal capacity, or collective resources, or collective capacity. So invariably, it's when we introduce man and social constructs and sometimes economic constructs into the equation that we can see disasters occurring.
So it's not the earthquake or the flood that's
Absolutely
the disaster, it's the poor planning.
Poor planning, poor siting, the quality of infrastructure, the quality of our social policy. So we're here talking about the needs of our disabled community. If our national social policies aren't at the standard that they should be in the normal times, then how are they going to be able to cope with challenging situations necessitated by a hazard impact?
I'll come back to that and how policy can shift and change to accommodate the needs of the disabled. Is there a knock-on effect, as I turn to Stephen O'Malley, that by looking after the needs of the disabled, you can somehow take care, provide cover to children, to elderly, to other special groups, people who are so-called marginalized groups in the society, and that therefore it's not just looking after a particular interest group, it's looking after the well-being of whole families and communities?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And I mean, it's interesting if you actually think about it and you say, you'd refer to children, et cetera, the elderly as marginalized group, but if we actually add up all that population, they're not the marginalized group. They are the community.
But they're on the margins of policy
and so
response.
One of the things that we, from my perspective in the humanitarian and the development community, have really had to come to terms with over the last 20 to 30 years was the inbuilt biases that we were coming with, in the sense that we were not taking proper account of the different needs of men and women, boys and girls. If you look at the research, for example, that HelpAge, a very well-known UK-based NGO, has done, you also see that the elderly are often left out of this, out of the planning process, and also left out of in a sense, out of the response. I mean, I saw this myself when I was living in New York during the time of Hurricane Sandy, and they took time to assist some of the elderly who were living in the most vulnerable areas. So I think one of the things that we have had to learn and begin to come to terms with is that different people have different needs. And those needs have to be properly taken into account. If you don't do that, you're not, as a state, you're not properly meeting the needs of your citizens. So you have to think very carefully, what are going to be the different needs of people, whether they're disabled or elderly, etc. So some of the research for this day suggests that 15% of the people around the world have some form of a disability. That's 1 billion people.
Right.
So if we are going to be responding to the different needs of people, that's what we have to keep in mind.
Well, that's the proportion I was about to get to, because for many politicians, that's not too large a number. It's not too big an interest group. Let me get your perspective on that. Somehow, unless they organize the squeaky wheel, gets the grease and so on, they don't get the attention of the policymakers because they're too small a number, the politicians, with the exception of Senator Ifill, of course, seem to think.
Well, I mean, I would probably disagree with you there. And I think, first of all, for those of us who are in the business, so to speak. We know, and we have learned the lesson, I would say, that we need to be much more inclusive in our planning and in our response, because knowing what the different needs of people will be allows us to have a better response. It allows us to anticipate what the possible consequences are. And Mr. Jackson said it very well. You know, what you're talking about is natural hazards. It's when they intersect with man that we can have a disaster. So the question becomes, how do we properly plan for that? And I would say that, you know, it's as disappointing for a able-bodied citizen to see their government fail as it is for someone who is disabled. The point is, no one wants to see their neighbor or a family member suffer because of a lack of planning and a lack of foresight.
All right. When we come back in this not so obvious conversation, we'll hear from someone who also is a member of the disabled community and can have a perspective on what they go through when the disaster warning is issued. That's coming up.
We are on Facebook. Join the growing Carib Vision community today. Go to www.facebook.com/Carib Vision. Be a part of our online family, whether you are located in Canada, the USA, or even farther away. Carib Vision is about what it means to be from the Caribbean, our culture, our lifestyles, our voices. Log on or switch us on. Carib Vision.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place. Carib Vision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Carib Vision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cable Vision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Carib Vision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Latin Festival and the St. Kitts Marriott presents the 4th annual Latin Fiesta. Sunday, October 27th at 1 p.m. The place to be is the Marriott Beach under the theme Dominican Republic Edition. Featuring Joseph Fonseca and Alendi. General admission for this event is EC $25 and VIP tickets $170 EC dollars, which includes a voucher from the Royal Beach Casino. Tickets are available at Cajola Cristata and Avalon Lab on St. Kitts and Avalon Lab on Nevis. This is one event you can't afford to miss. It's the 4th annual Latin Fiesta. Hasta la vista.
Tonight, live from the studios of the Caribbean Media Corporation in Bridgetown, Barbados, a regional, not so obvious conversation, disasters and disability. Let me bring in someone who has a perspective to share as a member of the disabled community. Granville Carter is the Vice President of the National United Society for the Blind. Welcome, Mr. Carter. Give me your perspective. Barbados in particular has not been affected by huge hurricanes, but when the rain falls and you can't get outside, it's a serious matter. We've had floods. We've had a few storms knock roofs and so on. What have the people who have been members of your association been telling you about their experiences? And your own, of course.
Well, I want to say a pleasant good night to everyone. My perspective is that one of the things that I think that needs to be done is that persons with disabilities need to know where they can go, who they can go to. I am aware that there are a number of district emergency offices in Barbados, And if you ask many of the disabled persons where their district relief organization is, they can't tell you. So I think that a little more communication between the various entities need to be expanded where persons with disabilities are concerned.
Well, what kind of form of communication should it take for the blind?
Well, persons with disabilities need to know in the event that there is, let's say, for argument's sake, a hurricane coming. Persons need to know like who their district officer is, who they can contact, and things to that effect. And also depends on the type of disability that the person has. They will need to know like what type of transportation they will need in order to be evacuated from their homes and things to that effect.
Do you not think, though, that the officials should know, since it's community-based disaster management and response, that they should know where those individuals are? And
Trust me, they should, but they don't.
They're invisible to them?
Yes, some, maybe not all.
Right.
I'm very visible. I don't know them. I don't think that they know me.
Right.
But to make a long story short, I do not wait as a person who is blind when a warning is issued to be scampering around.
Like the rest of us.
Well, whatever. I take it as my responsibility as a citizen of this country to prepare myself as best as possible.
Right.
What I usually do, I have my computer. I go on my computer and I check out the websites. I monitor the hurricanes, the passages. I keep in track with the various bulletins and so on.
On the radio?
Whether on the radio or on my computer. I usually get emails of the bulletins and stuff like that.
Right.
And that is something very important. So I keep abreast of what is going on. Beforehand, I make sure that I prepare myself, like getting my own hurricane supplies and things to that effect. Storage of water. I mean, it is really difficult for persons with disabilities, especially when their finances are so limited and they are unable to purchase the necessary things that they would need.
Right.
One of the things that I don't like, I really don't like going to shelters.
Why is that?
I prefer to be in a home situation with friends, family. I prefer to be that. I'm more comfortable in that type of situation.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of people in the able-bodied community who would share that view, but is it at all because of the environment in the shelters? Do you think that it would be an unwelcoming place for someone who is blind or visually impaired?
Well, I don't think that it is that difficult for the blind persons. I think it is much more difficult for persons probably who are using wheelchairs, right, or have some other form of physical, disability. But for me, I like the home settings. I'm much more comfortable there.
Right.
From the organization perspective, what we usually do, we try to get our members to, do similar things to what I am doing. Prepare ourselves, don't wait to the last minute. And then, we try to put a plan in place, because the authorities who are supposed to put the important plans in place to assist persons like myself, they're not doing it. We only hear a lot of talk, and there's not much action behind the talk. So we have to look after ourselves. And my organization, we usually sit and we plan, and we need to devise a strategy in relation to helping the persons who cannot assist themselves with food stuff and so on. Mm-hmm. And we put a plan in place to help assist in the event that there is the disaster strikes, that you know how we would be able to get to persons.
So it's about communication, it's about coordination, it's about strategy. Mr. Carter, thank you
exactly.
for joining a not-so-obvious conversation with unusual candor. I wish more people would regardless of what community they represent, just put it really where it is. And let me ask you, Senator Ifill, you were straddling two fences, or two sides of a fence. One, as a policymaker, as part of the policy structure, you've got to make sure that every citizen of this country is looked after through the policies. And yet you're hearing from Mr. Carter that the authorities consider, or rather don't even consider, the disabled. How do you, in the position that you're in as President of the Senate, be that voice for specific change in the way in which, and again, this is not a story that is unique to Barbados, this is repeated throughout the Caribbean. How do you, however, get the policymakers to understand the perspectives of the Granville Carters and the Kerryann Ifills?
One of the things that we do is we engage with a lot of the various agencies. We have conversations with, for example, the Vulnerable Persons Committee. When that was established in Barbados many years ago, they didn't have a representative of the community of persons with disabilities. They do now. And they have been working assiduously over the past year or more to ensure that the voice of persons with disabilities get out there. They've been using drama a lot to explain how persons with disabilities respond to disasters and stuff like that. They've done training with the disaster emergency organizations, the district emergency organizations, and so on. Various agencies for persons with disabilities often host activities and include the community. For example, the Barbados Council for the Disabled, we've done training with members of the fire service, members of the district emergency organizations, so too has the National Disabilities Unit and other agencies. And other members of the community have come forward and offered supplies in times of disasters, pending disaster at the beginning of the hurricane season, to ensure that the community of persons with disabilities aren't excluded. But it's an ongoing conversation. We keep talking to people and engaging them and trying to get them to understand. And at the policy level, whenever we're discussing policies, I try to ensure that I remind them that, you know, we need to look at the needs of persons with disabilities, engage them. As I said earlier, Barbados ratified the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and we are in the process of setting up the Monitoring and Implementation Committee for that. And so that too is going to have a knock-on effect, as you would say, in a lot of these strategies and areas. But even more than that, persons with disabilities themselves, they too have to be educated on what they need. Because if you are living with a disability, part of our life is organization. We cannot wait until the last minute to run out of the house or roll out of the house, as the case might be. We have to know ahead of time. We encourage people to develop personal safety plans, to know who you will go to. What Mr. Carter said about not being comfortable in the shelter, that is true for a lot of reasons, because the environment, you need something that you're familiar with. You want somewhere that you can manage to get around on your own. If you're in a shelter, in a situation where you're sleeping on, you know, mats or in sleeping bags or whatever, it's difficult. So you, in order to prevent that from happening, have plans ahead of time. So,
and indeed, Mr. Carter, like yourself, would say, we have a right to stay at home. If we think that our home is particularly secure, we have a right to stay right where we are.
Exactly. You have the right to stay where you are. But in taking that responsibility, you also have to be, and this is not just to persons with disabilities, it's anybody. If you are choosing to stay at home, make sure that you're choosing to stay in a safe environment because in the event that something does happen and emergency personnel do have to get you out, you can you can reduce the situation if you've provided things. For example, if you're a person that's dependent on insulin has to be refrigerated. Make sure that you have an ice box that you can keep your insulin in. You know, don't wait until the last minute to realize that this is a problem. Economics are a big part of the issue, as Mr. Carter said. But again, the agencies that work for persons with disabilities challenge them, champion them, work with them, let them know what some of your needs are going to be so that when the disaster does come, that you have some plans in place.
Ronald Jackson, at the level of early warning, is there a mechanism that can involve getting the word out to the disabled and also a conversation in a sense in which you find out what the particular needs are in the community?
Yeah, I think that's an area that is still underexploited. I think the mechanisms are there that will certainly allow you to get the message to the community. If you're hearing impaired, if you're sight impaired, to be able to get that message. Are we exploiting it across the Caribbean? Not enough.
Don't we have the technologies?
The technology is there, but it comes down again to cost and the level of partnership that needs to be developed with our telecommunications organizations, our telecommunications providers, and the government working in unison, the various government agencies working in unison to put the capacity where it needs to be able to deliver on these resources that are there. As I said, it exists. I mean, we have, and Stephen can probably talk about some of the projects through UNDP, which proof of concept, the fact that it can work, and there are various other good practices across the region and outside of the region.
Things that are happening in the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean. So it is happening. What we need to do is to resource it. I want to just draw, though, on a comment, the importance of having the technology and having the technology work for you. Certainly that holds true when there is a slow onset event. But when there is the earthquake event, then you could lose a lot of the capacity to be able to check your emails and to know what's happening. It goes back to the point of having very strong community-based emergency management mechanisms in place that is able to identify where the needs are and to support those needs.
Let's get practical, though. You said mechanism.
Yes.
Nice word.
Yes.
Powerful word.
Yes.
What do you really mean? How does it work on a real ground?
Well, I mean, a mechanism can be highly technological as well as it can be people-based. And that's what I'm talking about when it's what do you have available at that particular point in time. It may be an early warning system that is using two pot covers together and to strike that so that people know that particular sound means that it's time to move. And then the personnel within the communities who are identified as the key support mechanisms or key support persons for those persons with disability, go and pull them out of those communities and take them to the respective
Should
areas.
the organization know them? Or should they know the organization? Which is more important?
Both. I think it's both. It's both because, you could be at home, you may know the organization, you may know the various actors in the community, but when the time comes, you may not have the means to reach them. And that's why it has to be on both sides, because if I am working in the district organization or in the community organization and I know that Senator Ifill is in need of some support in these kinds of circumstances and I don't hear from her, then I know I should check. And this is the kind of things we teach at the national level or at the community level when we're working with communities. And I would hope that it is something that is a consistent practice across the board.
Right, Stephen O'Malley, best practice. What's happening in the Caribbean that encourages you that the concerns that you've heard tonight are actually being addressed and can actually be models for wider use?
Yeah, well, I think I want to build on a few things that people have already talked about. And I think the first point, and Mr. Carter said it very well, you have to prepare yourself for these events. So we have a multi-layered thing going on. You as an individual, you're assessing your environment. You're thinking, as you come into the summertime here, and as you come into July, August, you're thinking to yourself, all right, now I'm in a period of heightened risk. This is the time when hurricanes normally come. They may not affect Barbados as directly or as frequently as they do to other places, but as we see, that you've got the hardware stores and others selling your preparedness, you are thinking to yourself, what can I do? What can I afford? What is my particular situation? So you yourself are thinking that. The government at a whole series of different levels, and whether it's a municipal government, et cetera, community groups are also thinking, what do we need to get ready for this year? Are there people that we might know who are particularly vulnerable? And that may also be a decision we're making personally ourselves. We're thinking of our neighbor down the street who we know perhaps has had increased problems with mobility in the last year. So what extra steps you might want to be thinking. So again, you're talking about on a very personal level. We also have in that planning, this is what I was referring to earlier, we've come to grips a bit better with the fact that people have different needs. And that has to be accommodated. How do we best communicate? Well, look, 10 years ago, for example, you would never have thought of sending out emails as the predominant way to monitor, but now you would use a whole series of different social media techniques. You can use a variety of techniques about SMS messaging and so on. And these things, as you go around, with the exception of the SMS, you can go around the islands here and see how people are integrating those technologies. And that was one of the things that we did support through a recent UNDP program. I was, in fact, on Montserrat just last week. And of course, in Montserrat, they had the horrible event of the volcano eruption where, the entire city of Plymouth was destroyed. You had to evacuate more than half of the population and move them in very short order. They have now a system of sirens. They have a whole system of other types of notifications. Interestingly, and now I'll use an example, because they have an increased population of people from Spanish-speaking countries, what they've also done is adjusted their messaging, and this is what we're really talking about here. They realize that, well, if they just broadcast radio messages in English, there's a percentage of the population who may not fully understand and therefore may not fully benefit from those messages. So now they're doing Spanish as well. And that's what we're talking about here. You understand what the needs of the population are, the way those different needs present themselves, and you address them.
You hopefully will get another perspective in a moment from someone representing the deaf community in Barbados, Lionel Smith, the president of Deaf Barbados Incorporated. He'll be speaking through an interpreter, and he'll explain the experiences of people who are deaf and also hearing impaired when disaster strikes and how they can prevent it. A reminder to you that you can email us at IDDR Caribbean as an International Day for Disaster Reduction, IDDR Caribbean at gmail.com. You can also call us at 1-855-213-7500. It's a free call across the Caribbean, 1-855-213-7500 if you want to join this not-so-obvious conversation. And we can also hear you if you call us locally in Barbados at 467-1045, 467-1045. So in a moment, we'll get that perspective. We'll take a break and come back, and hopefully the conversation will continue on not only what's happening, but what can happen to help not only the disabled, but the wider community. And hopefully we'll come to an understanding that the people who say they're disabled are not so terribly different from the ones who say they are not. In a moment.
The entire world will converge on the natural Dominica for the 17th World Creole Music Festival, October 25th, 26th, and 27th. Live at the Windsor Park Sports Stadium, Roseau. The government of Dominica, in collaboration with Discover Dominica Authority and Gold Partner Digital present world-renowned and creators Kasam, undisputed soca king Marshall Montero, reggae dancehall superstar Busy Signal, compa MVPs Carry Me, are you ready? Nigerian sensation Rocket, Latino maestro Tito Puente Jr., featured Cada's icon Fitzroy Williams, Jean-Marc Ferdinand, Also, Triple K Global New Look Ola and Alex Alexi Patrice Olman. Quaxi Colo Swinging Stars King Dice Hunter Bob Daddy Chester Shapi and more. The 17th World Creole Music Festival. 3 nights of pulsating rhythms.
Latin Festival and the St. Kitts Marriott presents the 4th Annual Latin Fiesta. Sunday, October 27th at 1 p.m. The place to be is the Marriott Beach under the theme Dominican Republic Edition. Featuring Joseph Fonseca and Alendi. General admission for this event is EC $25 and VIP tickets $170 EC, which includes a voucher from the Royal Beach Casino. Tickets are available at Cajola Cristata and Avalon Lab on St. Kitts and Avalon Lab on Nevis. This is one event you can't afford to miss. It's the 4th Annual Latin Fiesta. Hasta la vista.
Tonight, disasters and disability, a not so obvious Caribbean conversation on this International Day for Disaster Reduction. The focus is on disaster and those who are disabled, and the message from them is we have rights no different from the rest of the community, but we also have needs that the rest of the community just doesn't pay enough attention to, whether at the level of governments, disaster or community disaster managers, even members of family. Let's hear now from a member of the disabled family in the Caribbean. He is Lionel Smith, the president of Deaf Barbados Incorporated. Welcome to the program. Let me ask you, Lionel, give me an example of the kinds of problems that people who are deaf and hearing impaired have that people who are blind, people who are in wheelchairs, don't necessarily have, but are no less important.
We have a lot of problems because there's no technology available for the deaf. For example, you have a weather system approaching and the deaf community are outside, they're clueless. That presents a big challenge for us.
And what specific things do you really want to see happening in the future?
Okay, I think in the future, we need to have some special technology that warns us when a system is coming. We need to have special programs for emergency, like, for example, warnings that you're having. I remember when Hurricane Sandy happened in America, there was an interpreter there with the mayor, and she was there interpreting and letting everyone know what was happening. And so I sat there and I was watching, and I was saying, you know what? Deaf people really need information because sometimes the family members don't tell us anything.
What kind of information would you like to get?
Okay, we need an interpreter on TV programs with the information available. The deaf use the phone a lot, getting messages, texting and everything, but there needs to be some system where there's something that comes through, whether it be any natural disaster, whether it be flooding or earthquakes or whatever.
All right. Well, that's, again, another major point. Thank you, Lionel Smith. I'll come back to you in a moment, but they need some mechanism for early warning, SMS text messaging and so on. What other kinds of technology would you like to see used generally in the Caribbean, not just at disaster time? Senator Ifill.
Oh dear, how long do we have?
Until 9:30 East Caribbean time. Off you go.
In all seriousness, closed captioning for deaf and hearing impaired persons, that's a definite necessity in a lot of areas, a lot of places. Audio description for blind and visually impaired persons, where you have a description of what's going on visually on the screen. Mm-hmm. You need a system where you can call in as a blind, vision impaired, deaf, hearing impaired, whatever. The deaf and hearing impaired need the TTY system where they can do the telephoning and stuff like that. There are so many different aspects to it that we would need to have.
Right.
But I think one of the biggest things is education. We need people to be educated because we're talking about the deaf, we're talking about the blind and visually impaired, but there's a segment of the community of persons with disabilities that we haven't touched on, and that is the intellectually challenged, the autistic, the persons that live with other challenges where the communication may be available. They can hear it, but they can't understand what you're telling them. So you need to have provisions in place to assist persons like that. People that can't communicate by speech, and I'm not talking about the deaf now, I'm talking about persons who can hear perfectly well, but they can't verbalize what's going on. You need systems in place where they too can get their information communicated over to other people. I'll give you an example. There was a young lady traveling on an airline recently, and she was told, just as we all are, that during takeoff and landing, she had to turn off
her cell phone,
her iPad.
Oh, iPad.
And she could not speak. This was her only means of communication. So in essence, you're telling her that for 45 minutes, let's say half an hour, she cannot speak.
Right.
Suppose something happens during that time frame and she needs to communicate with somebody, she can't. And that was a major problem. What happens in the event of a disaster when someone like that turns up at a shelter, when somebody comes to evacuate your home, when you need to communicate to that person, what's the challenge? And that person can't communicate back to you. So we need to educate people about what kinds of disabilities are out there and what are the provisions that need to be put in place.
All right. When I come back to you, I want you to educate me. You've been talking about TTY. It's something that's widely used in the developed world, nowhere to be found in this part of the world, so you've got to explain that. You've been tapping away on a keyboard all evening long. I will give you the opportunity to explain to those of us who are not so privileged to communicate, to text while talking, about what that is and how useful that is and how powerful a tool that is. But let's take a call now from Dominica. Thank you for joining us on disaster and disability. Join our not so obvious conversation, please, with your question or comment.
The question I have is, what concrete plans are in the works to help the blind or deaf after the system?
After the system?
Yes.
All right. So that's a concrete question. What is there or can there be in place after the system has passed? And again, Senator Ifill just mentioned there's a whole range of other people that we haven't really brought into that conversation. Ronald Jackson.
Well, thanks for posing that question to me. I think, again, I would openly say that's an area that a lot of the emergency management plans need improvement on. And I think it's an area, certainly from a regional standpoint, that we're promoting the kind of revision of these emergency management plan, pre and post, to really address some of those issues. Invariably, what happens is a one-size-fits approach, and that doesn't really cut it. I think the two things we have to look at is how we communicate before, how we communicate afterwards, and then having communicated, what are the constructs, and we spoke about the social policy and the social infrastructure that looks at supporting the needs of everybody. I mean, it's not just the social policy doesn't just address those with special needs.
Forgive me, Mr. Jackson, but it sounds very much like a no to her question.
Huh?
That it sounds like a no.
It's a no, but I'm going beyond the no to say that we need to look at those areas. There are plans, and the plans are rolled out in a very general way, and so persons with disabilities sometimes get caught in that general rollout of the plan. But what we're talking about is moving from a generalist approach to having some specific areas that address specific needs.
All right. Let's move now to Trinidad and Tobago. Don Wilson wants to say something about those who are hearing impaired. Good evening and welcome to our conversation. Don Wilson, are you there from Trinidad and Tobago with your question or comment? I think there's someone on the line, but...
Hello?
Yes. Ms. Wilson?
Oh, yes. Hi.
Go right ahead with your question or
I'm
comment.
impaired myself.
Right.
And I wanted to share that Jamaica has an excellent ad that is full of graphics, so that if you cannot hear what is being said in the advert, you can see, for instance, the one that they've done on Duck, Cover, and Hold On. It's an excellent example that would help someone who's hearing impaired prepare for an earthquake. And it's that sort of thing that's helpful. Anything that's graphic, anything that's written in big, helps someone who's hearing impaired and someone who's deaf and literate.
Right.
All right?
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson, for your comment.
Okay,
appreciate that. That animated public service announcement wasn't, so far as I know, when it was produced, directly intended for the disabled community, but it had value for that caller. Care to comment on that?
No, well, I think that's what we've been talking about in terms of how do we make our media products serve multiple purposes, reach multiple groups, target audience, and some of it certainly, yes, there's the graphic, there are the images, but they need to be captioned as well in some instances, and they're not always captioned.
Stephen O'Malley, your comment.
Well, I think the most important thing for us is that every time we have one of these events, we learn something. And we learn about what we didn't do right. We learn the things that worked, but we also learn the things that didn't go right. And you have to then change and continue to change your processes to make sure that you're learning. And if, the point that we have been discussing is if there are people who have been excluded and thus not properly served, and we've recognized that that's the point that we're trying to do now, to better be inclusive. What are the ways that you make sure that you're communicating, as a government, as a storm system approaches, that you're communicating, so sending your messages out, but equally, what are the ways that people with different needs can be coming and asking their questions and getting an answer in a way that suits them?
Let's briefly now go to someone who has experience from the broader disabled community globally. He's joining us now via Skype. Jeffrey James, he's the Regional Director of HelpAge International. You heard us talk about HelpAge before. It's a global institution that speaks on behalf of the disabled. It champions the cause not only of disabled people, but other vulnerable groups, the aged as well. Jeffrey James, thank you for joining us. Hope you can hear us via Skype. This is live television. Things like these happen. There he is on a less than perfect connection. But Jeffrey James, if you're hearing me, answer this question. Are you satisfied that we adequately deal with the needs of the special groups that are part of your organization, HelpAge? All right. He can hear us, I suspect, but unfortunately we're not able to hear him. We'll sort that out and come back to him because he does have a perspective from around this region. He's the regional director for HelpAge International, but he will have the global perspective. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to get a lesson in the technology of the disabled. Let's talk about this keyboard that you've been using, Senator Ifill. What is it really? It has fewer keyboards than the good old QWERTY keyboard of the typewriter or the computer.
It's called a Braille display, and a Braille display is a unit that has the capacity to give you electronic refreshable Braille so that you don't have to have a hard copy printout. It's connected via Bluetooth to several devices, your computer. Right now I have it connected to my phone. And this way I'm reading my notes and reminding myself of things that I need to inject into the conversation we're having this evening. And this comes in handy because it allows me to participate meaningfully just like anybody else. and I can read information like anybody else can. Anytime you send out bulletins, Twitter announcements, messages, that kind of thing. So yes, it's very handy and useful for persons with disabilities.
So you've been tweeting through this entire program?
No, I don't tweet.
Right. Well, you're joining some other members of the able-bodied community who find no absolute use for that. But would you?
It's not that I don't find use for it. It's simply that I don't have the time to tweet. And if I tweet, somebody's going to tweet back, and then I have to tweet to them. And no, that's too much tweeting for me. So I stick
140 characters.
There you go. I stick to email. Email works beautifully for me. But what I wanted to say about the assistive technology, now that you've introduced it into the conversation, when persons with disabilities are technology, I know a lot of us have smartphones, we have our iPads, and we say we couldn't live without them.
Right.
But for persons with disabilities, that's not an exaggeration in a lot of cases. That is the reality. A lot of us cannot live without our technology. And so when you show up at a hurricane shelter and you're toting a laptop, people are like, why is she bringing that in here? She's bringing that in here because that's her life. That's not just... It's not just entertainment. It's not business.
Right.
There's a lot of information available to you there.
Is that communication to the so-called outside world, or is it communicating?
It's communicating in general.
In general.
I mean, for example, I'll give you a very basic example. Credit card information.
Right.
I was once in the U.S. There was a storm over the tarmac, and I could not get... my flight was delayed getting back to Barbados. I had to communicate with others, and I needed my credit card information in order to place the call. And then I realized I had to ask a perfect stranger to read my credit card number for me. I could have gotten wiped out that way.
Right.
Thank goodness he didn't do that. But through technology, I can keep track of that kind of information and not have to ask anybody else to give me that. I don't need to violate my privacy that way again. I also don't need to be afraid when I'm out that I can't get what I need to get because I have that communication. So to you, your cell phone is...
Bling.
Yeah, bling. The way that you need to communicate and get all the information you need. But it's even more than that for me. It's a lot of things. And that's just a very basic example.
Expensive technology? Are you the exception or the...
I always say blindness is a habit I can't afford. And that's because a lot of the things that we do need and that do help us out is very expensive. This tool, as small as it is, as neat as it is, it costs in the region of $2,600 US. And no, I didn't buy it myself. And when you couple that to your regular smartphone, you're looking at a bill of close to $4,000 roughly sometimes US. So it's amazingly expensive to live as a person with a disability, but it's technology that really, really helps. A lot of the newer technology, and it comes back to the disaster preparedness discussion, a lot of the newer technology comes with built-in accessibility, but a lot of people aren't educated. You go into the IT store and you say, I want to buy an iPad, and they look at you like, oh, why would she want an iPad? They ain't even got no buttons on that thing.
Right.
But I want one because it's got built-in technology that can help me out. There's technology that can help the deaf and hearing impaired, that can help persons who are low vision, that can help persons who have motor challenges, physical challenges and stuff like that. So when you look at it, there is a lot of technology, but people out there don't know how to harness it and therefore provide assistance to persons living with disabilities.
But should the wider population, people who are so-called able-bodied, when they go on the computers and they see the TTY part of the software and the disabled logo, which suggests that that's for a member of the disabled community to use, we tend to go past that. Should we?
Flying. No, you shouldn't. Because the reason why you shouldn't is, I tell people all the time, disability is a non-discriminating club. Anybody can join us at any time. And you'd be amazed what information you will need to have if something happens to you or your family, and you need to have this information at your fingertips. But more than that, while it isn't necessary for you to learn how to write 100 words in Braille a minute, it is important for you to know what Braille is. People assume that as soon as you become blind, you wake up the next day and you can read Braille. You need to understand that people that live with diabetes, for example, they suffer with neuropathy. Their fingertips aren't sensitive enough, some of them, to use Braille. You may also realize that people who live with other types of disabilities can use Braille. Cerebral palsy, for example, some people have challenges processing print images, but it can process Braille images. There are different things that you need to understand and learn, and it will help people to communicate better. For example, we're here having this not so obvious conversation. Are any of the ads that are in between these closed caption? Do you have provisions made for persons who are hearing impaired to get involved with this conversation? Do you have this sign language is on this evening because we've got Mr. Smith, but do you usually have that as part of your production? No, it isn't. And it's definitely information that you need to have because other people in the community need to have this information as well. The technology is there. Incorporating it is the problem. And because when we are using our computers and our devices, we skip past that little accessibility symbol because it doesn't mean anything to us, we're also missing out on the opportunity to mean something to somebody else.
All right, Senator Ifill, we did warn you it was a not so obvious conversation, so the brick bats and bouquets are flying left, right, and center. And they should be because your life might depend on it. Join us after the break when we talk to Jeffrey James. We've sorted out the connection. He'll join us via Skype to talk about the view of HelpAge International on this International Day for Disaster Reduction. Back in a moment.
My name is Ronald, and I do wheelchair dancing. When I was a year and 2 months old, my parents had just made some coffee and had it at the end of a table. And I crossed the bar and I went over and I pulled it down on my chest. Right? They rushed me to the hospital, which was a first-degree burn. Whatever happened, I don't know. Both legs became blue-black. Persons were saying I received wrong medications. People were saying the medication did not agree with me. And they said that if they didn't amputate my legs, I will die.
I love Indra. I love working with Indra. Thanks for making my life so easy. I mean, words. Can I just show it? Can I just go and give her a hug?
You wouldn't drive a car with only 3 wheels, nor would you build your house on shaky ground. Then let's not treat our children any different. Every child deserves the right start, regardless of his social or economic background. Every child deserves a chance to reach his fullest potential. The Foundation for the Development of Caribbean Children wants to build a region of achievers, but we need your help. Let's give our children the foundation they deserve.
Give them hope and show them love.
A message from the Foundation for the Development of Caribbean Children.
Had calls so far from Dominica and Trinidad and Tobago. It's still time until 9:30 East Caribbean time, 8:30 if you're in Jamaica, to call us toll free 1-855-213-7500, 1-855-213-7500, and if you're in Barbados, 467-1045, 467-1045. You can still shoot us an email at iddrcaribbean@gmail.com, iddrcaribbean@gmail.com. I suspect I'll be getting one of those emails just now. But let's go to Jeffrey James, the Regional Director for HelpAge International. He'll be joining us via Skype to weigh in on this not-so-obvious conversation. A lot of the things that you didn't think about, and I didn't think about, we've already started to discuss, and we're going to get, we suspect, a few more of those kinds of perspectives also from our studio audience assembled here at the CMC. Jeffrey James, good evening.
Yes,
I'm hearing you.
Yes.
We want to get the perspective of HelpAge International. First, explain what HelpAge is and does.
HelpAge is an international non-government organization. Our main office is in London, United Kingdom, we work primarily with older people, but we recognize that people live in families, and many times they are responsible for young children, and a lot of older people come down with different forms of disabilities from time to time. So you may find a number of older people who are visually impaired. Some of them have problems with hearing, and a lot of them have physical mobility problems. So this issue of disability and disasters is something that we pay attention to in our work with older people and disasters. We recognize, as Dr. Jackson said, that the approach to dealing in terms of preparation and responding to natural disasters has been more of a generalist approach. And older people, persons with disabilities, children, and other vulnerable groups are not brought into the forefront. The needs are not taken into account in disaster management. And so that is how we have come into this whole era of disaster risk reduction and emergency response, because we recognize that vulnerable groups are not being looked after. The situation has changed somewhat because we recognize that organizations like the Red Cross and some of the national disaster organizations that have more that experience natural disasters on a more frequent basis. They are now realizing that some needs are unmet where it pertains to some of these vulnerable groups. I've been listening to the discussion, and one of the things that I know has been said is what happens to people who have hearing impairment. That is one of the main issues. And these people, this community, complain a lot that you may have a hurricane approaching. They're not aware of it because these people live by themselves. They may only observe their neighbors making preparations, and that's something how they do, because the medium of communication, usually it's radio, it's television, and if you're hearing impaired, you're not going to be able to pick up the messages. So I think the community that has hearing impairment, they are one of the most affected. There's also the problem that people who are visually impaired have as well. They may be able to watch television and listen to the radio, but sometimes a lot of these people don't have radio, they don't have television, and they have no means of knowing. I think what needs to be done is that you need to have very explicit policies which cater to these special interest groups. But also, where you have community approaches to disaster risk reduction, that you have to have a more inclusive approach, that you involve these different types of groups into the planning process. You discuss with them what their needs are and how you need to respond to them. Because a lot of times the plans are made and people are not included.
Well, we've heard that quite loud and clear, not just from you, but throughout the course of this evening. Jeffrey James, many thanks for joining us on a less than perfect connection via Skype, but still an important input into our not so obvious conversation. Many thanks. Let me go to an email. It comes from Roger. It says, "Good evening. I'm a blind person. If a tsunami strikes, how will I get the warning given the rapid nature of the event?" Now, CDEMA has been doing a lot of work on tsunamis, trying to educate people about this. There could be a major eruption or seismic event that could trigger a tsunami. You say there's not a lot of time left to head to high ground. It's tough for able-bodied people, let alone the disabled.
Yeah, I think it's always going to be difficult there. I mean, it's already challenging to transmit the message for able-bodied persons when a tsunami strikes, and then to get it to all the people who need to know. And it goes back to how do we exploit the technology, but more than that, going back to what Senator Ifill said about being educated about some of the science. I mean, we teach, even for the able-bodied, certain rules of thumb. When you feel a significant earthquake, the fact that you don't wait to receive a particular message if you're very coastally based population, but to try and go for high ground, then the issue is also where is high ground? And how do we get our disabled community to know about the particular high ground locations and how to get there, whether they need to be assisted to get there. Mm-hmm. And I think Senator Ifill has probably some interesting stories out of the tsunami experience in Japan, mm-hmm. which the Japanese are a community with a risk management culture. What we're trying to promote here in the Caribbean, yet they would have had challenges dealing with the tsunami. So it's always going to be difficult to get that message to all the people who need to know. So it really comes down to how well we educate them before the event.
You're talking about culture.
Culture, changing the culture of our people.
That's a tall order, Senator Ifill.
Very tall order. I always say the biggest barrier to disability is attitude. And attitude is closely linked to culture. We have a laissez-faire attitude about a lot of things in the Caribbean. Right. And that is unfortunately going to be a big barrier we have. But what Mr. Jackson referred to about the tsunami in Japan, that is a very real and living example. Twice as many persons with disabilities perished as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami, and a lot of it came because they did not have the communication. They produced an excellent DVD, and this DVD is on sale through the Japanese Deaf Federation. It's the DVDs, they're fundraising to assist persons who are affected by that disaster. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that the DVD brought out forcefully was that people who were blind, nobody was telling them what was going on around. It's afterwards they got information. The deaf, one guy said he just decided to give up. Why could he couldn't go any further, nobody was explaining anything, he didn't understand what was happening. So he just wanted to give up and to die because it didn't make any sense. Nothing was making any sense in his world anymore. And that tsunami, when it hit, it was rapid, as we know, but a lot of it had to do with communication. The information didn't get out to people. And like I said earlier, living with a disability means organization, and it also means that persons who work in disaster preparedness, they have to be organized and be prepared to deal with situations. Yes, if it happens tomorrow, we don't have this experience, we don't know, but we know about it happening in other places. We can incorporate. Now that we've heard how visual and helpful those ads are, we know, okay, we need to tweak those a bit and add something to make it even better for other persons so that we can get that information ahead of time.
Let me bring in the perspective of someone who is a part of the United Nations system in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, Violet Speak-Warnery. She is with UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Organization. Violet, I suspect you want to talk about the perspective of disabled children. That's a very discreet group of people, but I won't put words in your mouth. Give me your perspective.
Yes, well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think we've talked about marginalization and the groups that are marginalized. I think you were talking about, the elderly, women, children. So yes, in general, children are more vulnerable because of just their age. There's a measure of being taken care of still when you're a child, and at different levels. There are different kinds of vulnerabilities as you grow up. But a child that is vulnerable because of disability, already, if you look at their place in society, they have another vulnerability because of that. We already know that children who are disabled, for example, are more at risk for abuse, violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. We also know that they're not in the school systems as often as other children, that they don't have the access to other sort of social services, health services. So already that's the norm. Now, if you think that a disaster will happen, then I think there are three scenarios that you need to think of. One, the child that is disabled herself, her or himself, who is going to take care of them in that moment in time? How do they know about the situation? Where are they? Are they at home, which often is still the case? Are they in school? If they're not in school, are they in a special school? Who's looking after that special school? How does that information get there? There's also those children that are living with caregivers who might be disabled. That also makes them vulnerable. And we have a lot of those. We have caregivers who have children or they're taking care of children. So who takes care if their caregiver can't take care of them? How do they know the information? And then we also need to think that in times of emergencies, depending on the emergency, but the child might be, and anybody, is more at risk to become disabled. So we have those who are disabled already, and then those that become disabled because of emergencies. It could be temporary, but if we don't take care of them right then and there, they could become permanent. And I think this is a really important issue that, yes, we can talk about preparedness, which is essential. Right. And children need to be there to be talking about their voice, their opinions need to be there, especially those who have disabilities. But then also in the response. Where are we in response? I can remember myself, I went to Haiti for the first 2 months after the earthquake. And the multiplicity of children had complications because debris had fallen on them. So these were not disabled children beforehand, but they were afterwards. And then their families had either a mother or father had died, they were in orphanages, they had to be relocated. Major issues.
But what about disabled children in Haiti at that time? What was your experience with them?
Very, very, very difficult. They already have a very difficult life to start off with.
Right.
And then to add on to that, of course, comes the complication of just normal access to food, basic water facilities. Just another example, when Hurricane Thomas passed by St. Lucia, the issue of water. Water was a scarce resource at that moment in time. We then need to prioritize those most marginalized groups because it's usually those who can come forward who will get the water, who will get the food. But it's actually then that the organizations need to say, no, we need to target. We need to prioritize. And I think that's what we need to be saying in this conversation. We need to prioritize. We can't just have this generalization anymore. We need to think of those marginalized groups.
So briefly, you're saying essentially that in the disaster plan, in the concrete plans that you heard mentioned earlier, you don't want to see a situation where the disabled are part of the conversation. You're suggesting that they are first because there's a triage, and you're saying, let's deal with the people who are least able to get access to help.
Exactly, and I think it's not just the national emergency plans.
Right.
It needs to be in the various plans, sectoral plans, health, education, housing, shelter. They all need to think through this issue. What do we do with the most marginalized groups? Every sector needs to think of that, and not just as a sector or as a government, but we as people, and also the NGOs. There are many NGOs, many community groups, faith-based groups. What are they thinking when they're thinking about preparedness and helping?
Well, let's speak Warnery. Many thanks. Representing UNICEF. Let me get one perspective from you, Granville Carter, National Society, United Society for the Blind. You wanted to add again to the discussion? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hello?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Earlier, Senator Ifill alluded to the fact in relation to technology. My question is, wanting to have information disseminated to the vulnerable persons, like blind, deaf, or whatever classification of disability you have. When you speak technology for the disabled, it's very, very expensive. And this is a way that information can be disseminated to these vulnerable persons. My question is, what can the government do, or what can the service providers do to assist such persons?
You mean the telecommunications service providers?
Yes. For argument's sake, in order for me to use a cell phone, a good cell phone that I can receive and send the information that I need to receive or send, I have to have one that can speak because they cannot see it.
Right.
So, and these cell phones are very expensive, mind you. And the average disabled person, some of us are not working, and these technologies very expensive, and a person such as me cannot afford this technology, but it is a definite need for such persons.
Let me get the perspective of the three individuals. They represent governments in different sense, but directly to the person who represents a particular national government. Senator Ifill, what's your perspective? The technology is expensive.
Yes, it is. As I said, blindness is a habit I can't afford.
Right.
And it sounds like I'm making a joke out of it, but it isn't. It's a reality. It's expensive to have a disability. The technology is one aspect of it. There's so many other things. If you're a person who's incontinent, you need to use the adult briefs and stuff like that. These are not things they're not sexy. They're not things people want to talk about. But it is a reality that a lot of our persons live with. And in times of disasters, they become even more necessary. What can governments do? We know that we have a difficult economic situation going on. There's no sense in hiding from it. People say it's an excuse, but it's a reality we're living with. But there are strategies we can put in place. As Mrs. Speak Warner said, you can prioritize. Start looking at how you can make it a priority to provide. As I said earlier, technology to a lot of persons with disability is not a luxury, it's a necessity. If you move away from the thinking that, oh, he just wants a phone to call this person, or and you realize that this is a lifeline, then you can start putting mechanisms into place. Recently in the U.S., they passed a law where they have to make all types of technology accessible to persons with disabilities. That law it can speak to a lot of other issues and aspects of things. If we could do similar things here, making it necessary for persons when they are putting things in place to provide opportunities for persons with disabilities.
So would you like to see in each Caribbean country a kind of a basic national disabilities act which goes to not just benefits, but also making sure that the voice of the disabled is heard just as anybody else is?
Of course, definitely. If you're looking at telecommunications, there are strategies they can offer, reduced rates on certain types of technology, build packages into things so that you can use, for example, deaf and hearing impaired persons. They don't necessarily have the need for the 100 minutes a month,
right,
but 500 text messages a month, that can go a long way to helping persons who are deaf. If, different packages like that can help in a lot of ways and instances.
Thank you, Senator Ifill. We are practically out of time. Yeah. Just a few seconds left. Stephen O'Malley, is it really so bleak? Can there be a better way forward for the disabled when it comes to disasters in the Caribbean?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is what the discussion has covered. There are, we know that we haven't been doing a good enough job. We've been working, and here I'm not just talking about this region, I'm talking about this as a global issue. We have not been doing a good enough job. We understand the problems much better. We are starting to see movement in a number of areas, as we've already discussed. It's not going. It hasn't been happening quickly enough, but I'm very optimistic that with some good activity, we can get there.
Change of priorities. Ronald Jackson, final words.
Most certainly. I think we have to stop being generalists, and it's happening already. I think in Jamaica, you saw where the focus was on children. We've now focused on disabled and the elderly. So we are getting the sense that we have to now look at the different communities, and it's important that we bring them to the table.
And from a regional perspective?
And from a regional perspective, that's part of what we're going to be looking at within the context of our strategy and how we roll that out within the countries.
Ronald Jackson of CDEMA, Senator Kerryann Ifill of Barbados, Stephen O'Malley of UNDP, thank you for being with us. And thank you at home and here at the CMC studio for our not-so-obvious conversation that doesn't end here. Continue to talk about the disaster plan for your family, whether or not there's a disabled member of the community. But for now, put them first. It's good night from CMC.